Hello and welcome back to this damn fully idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the Classicflix Blu-ray release of The Killer Is Loose from 1956, which is a police drama or melodrama which also can be considered film noir, even though it's getting towards the end of what is roughly considered the key sort of classical noir period, which ended in the late 1950s. But what's interesting about this film and what makes it really special and notable is this was directed by Budd Boetticher, really in the sort of main heyday of his directorial career. This is just after he had made the first of the iconic landmark Randolph Scott westerns in Seven Men From Now, and just before the start of the so-called renowned cycle of westerns that continued what Seven Men From Now started. So this is between Seven Men From Now and The Tall T in 1957. And you've also got wonderful photography by the legendary Lucien Ballard, who would shoot some of the renowned films and worked with Boetticher a number of times, and shot some of the most incredible westerns and other films ever made, but also had a really great penchant for getting the most out of a low-budget crime drama or noir, as you see in great classic films like Murder by Contract, for example. So this was a wonderful team to come to what is essentially a little programmer. This was made, I believe it was technically made independently and released through United Artists. Boetticher himself didn't, just basically describe this in some interviews and things as a picture to make to prove to the studios that he could just go out and make something on a budget and come up with impressive results. And it was a script that was already sort of sitting around or making the rounds and wasn't particularly a great script, or it was a modest production essentially. And that becomes very apparent when you see that this is a very small, very self-contained film. It's very short in terms of the runtime. It's basically 73 minutes and was based on a Saturday Evening Post story, so it's a very small story. And since it deals with with essentially a killer breaking out of prison and going after a police detective who inadvertently, in the process of trying to capture said criminal, wound up accidentally shooting his wife instead. You can tell where this story is going, and we've seen this type of story many times, particularly on television and various police dramas. So it's very familiar what concepts are being played with here, and so the actual setup and the eventual conclusion are not really going to be much of a surprise. And again, there's not much running time to play with, and there's not a giant budget either. It's how this is handled and the fact that the film manages to generate real suspense and have a quality of realism to it, and honestly, there's a grit here, which, of course, with it being directed by Budd Boetticher, you would expect if you know particularly the iconic Randolph Scott westerns that he made, that there will be grit on display in a Budd Boetticher film. But it's these elements and the fact that the story actually feels lived in, and the characters actually seem three-dimensional and not stock, that make this notable and make it important and really worth discussing, because otherwise you can see how somebody else would just take this and just crank it out as a programmer title, and it would honestly feel like a number of 50s films that feel just like expanded television episodes, because by this point the lighting and staging and photography in the 50s in terms of lower budgeted theatrical releases and B films had gotten to the point of not being distinguished all that much from television of the era. So you would go into this maybe thinking that, it's not much to write home about, if you didn't look at the cast and crew list. As I said before, the plot is very straightforward. We open with a bank robbery that is eventually traced by the lead detective, played by Joseph Cotton, to one of the bank staff, played by Wendell Corey, and in the process of trying to apprehend him, the Corey character's wife is inadvertently killed by the lead police detective. And it's quite well done and quite striking how that is staged, and how the villain of the piece is not really ostensibly villainous on the surface. This has got to be the most atypical aspect of this film, that our villain character, played by Wendell Corey, is never overtly villainous. He's very quiet, he's very reserved, he wears these very thick glasses and can't really see without them, but he's also got particular hang-ups that become very, very obvious, but they never overwhelm his seeming inherent goodness and his mild-manneredness. It's just these moments of violence that sort of erupt out of nowhere, which honestly make the moments of violence more striking and more disturbing than just it being a very hostile villain or a merely psychotic villain, as you would typically expect from a simple story like this. And it's Corey's performance as the titular killer that is loose that is what's going to stick with you most. It's a very striking performance, particularly for somebody who never got the chance to really have big lead standout moments. I guess today he's probably most remembered for playing the old detective buddy of Jeffries in Rear Window, who shows up a number of times with a sort of laid back charm and not really paying any attention, or thinking that Jeffries is just off his rocker from being cooped up in his apartment for all this time. So for all of us who know him from Rear Window and other films he would pop up in, this is a real change of pace. And again, it's the particular portrayal and the setup of this character being so mild-mannered, even though he's just having to kill people. It's just things keep happening, and he just has to kill them. He doesn't want to, and that type of aspect to a villain really is something you I mean, still to this day it's less commonly used than more typical out and out baddies. And so having a character that is a real psychological study is part of what sets this film apart. And I think the relationship the audience develops with this character, in terms of in some strange ways still being able to sympathize with him, because he's obviously not in his right mind and obviously has many different hang-ups and past traumas that have added up to all of these moments of violence. It does fit in with the more multifaceted villain portrayals in the Boetticher Scott Westerns. So if you know the iconic villains in the Scott Westerns, even just looking at what would pop up with Richard Boone's villain in The Tall T in the next year, how multifaceted that villain is, and how the hero and villain have a deep connection that is brought up many times over the course of the film, and they have a direct focus on the other. Well, all those are paralleled here in The Killer is Loose, and whether that was originally in the script or it's something Boetticher added or merely honed in on is up for debate. But it's very much still connected to things you'll see in the Boetticher Scott Westerns, and I think this is furthered by the really strong lead performance by Joseph Cotten as the lead police detective. And this is where I get to the quality I mentioned before, that this film has a lived-in feel. Without this, the film would be very flat, and you'd probably forget in 5 seconds, because the script is very simplistic and very much on the nose, and there's not a lot of runtime to play with. But Cotton's performance is his usual masterful turn. Here he gives this detective, it's never expressly stated, but you can just feel the sense of world weariness that he carries the whole time. Of course, Cotton was older by this point and had the wonderful sort of sense of age in just his persona by that point, compared to seeing him in his more famous films, particularly in the early to mid 1940s. And he just comes into this film, and you get the sense of this as a career police detective who has years of experience and years of all these experiences just starting to get to him and weigh him down. And then in the opening, when he inadvertently shoots the wrong person, and how that particular mistake comes back to haunt him, in terms of the escaped killer now coming for both him and his wife, played by Rhonda Fleming. And then you get a nice sort of dynamic between husband and wife, because of course the wife is tired of her husband going through all of this, and he has to try and downplay the danger of the scenario. So none of this, again, is alien to anyone who's ever seen a police drama in the past, 40, 50 years, because this stuff has been done time and time and time again, if not many, many times on police television series. So again, everything's going to seem very familiar, but it's this lived-in quality I'm getting at that makes it feel like it's, something that actually did happen or could happen. Everything is believable to the point of the characters acting, for the most part, pretty rationally. There's just, of course, some instances towards the end of the film that the script makes the characters do to simply set up the climax, which, since you've only got 73 minutes to play with, and it was already a very basic script, means, unfortunately, that's kind of baked in, and you'll be expecting that anyway for a film of this type from this era. But there's a nice dynamic between the performances of Cotton and Fleming. There's a nice sort of feeling that these two obviously have a history together, and that their concerns are legitimate. And there's also a sort of aspect of, at least you get some feeling of the human condition, and Fleming's performance has a certain sensuality to it, which again I think links this film to the Boetticher Scott westerns, because you get that with the female characters in those films, even though they're obviously usually not depicting married couples. You get that same sort of, it's almost a sort of buried sensuality in the female characters in a lot of Boetticher's films, and I think you get that here too with Fleming's performance, even though it's a very straightforward, stereotypical sort of wife worried about her police detective husband, and now this guy's out on the loose and seemingly able to slip through all the police roadblocks. And it's nicely handled how we actually see the killer making it through all the police dragnets and attempts to catch him, and all of them are believable and done to the point of it's just possible for somebody to be able to sneak through, because no dragnet is completely perfect, and that of course adds to the suspense factor. It also helps that this film is obviously set in a smaller town, and with some of the houses that you see, it almost gives it maybe a touch of the feeling of being a film set in suburbia. But it's also obviously one of the noirs that is not a big city noir. It's a small city noir. So it has that feeling of being in a smaller city and having some scenes out in the countryside, and so that type of setting always gives any sort of noir a slightly different flavor. You don't quite get that full urban jungle feeling like you do in most noirs. So that also helps to distinguish it a little bit. It's obviously a mixture of mostly studio bound and on a lower budget, so they do what they can, and they had a very short shooting schedule, but it helps that you have one of the great cameramen and Lucien Ballard trying to dress up everything as much as possible. So the film is quite good visually, and that makes it feel like a more expensive film. It's more expressive, and the distinction between the scenes in the households they're in and the small sort of city downtown area and the police headquarters versus being out in the open countryside, particularly when our killer escapes from the work gang on a farm and then has to make his way back to the city, and he has to obtain a car and he has to obtain a disguise. There's a lot of really nice sort of different visual locales that almost along with this killer being so emotionally distant, there's a sort of there's this quality of there's a slight eeriness to all of the scenes where we're following the killer instead of the detective, and this is, I think, enhanced by the fact that Corey's performance is so rigid, and he's got these really thick glasses on, and so his gaze is almost distant, because he's this character is obviously not a normal person, has so many hang-ups, but it means that when the moments of violence are set up, they are built to, and when they happen, they are quite striking. And again, I keep making connections to the Scott westerns, but it's the same thing there. When you have the outbursts of violence, they are built up to, and then they are sudden, and they in their connotations, even though you don't see any blood or anything, they are quite gruesome, and they stick with you because they are built up to, and then they are over fast, and then it's the impact that hits you, which of course is extraordinarily realistic. Boetticher was very much ahead of his time in terms of making violence realistic and psychologically motivated and very much felt by an audience. I think he was right there with Anthony Mann in the 1950s in terms of really conveying the sense of violence and it being psychologically motivated. And this film also has a lot of the earmarks of, I think, the Anthony Mann noirs, particularly the films like T-Men, which were done outside the main studio system, and so they have that sort of independent flair and that sense of getting a heck of a lot more value for a low budget because you've got some really creative geniuses on both sides of the camera making the most out of what was a very simple script and production. So I think those factors are what make this really striking and special. And it's also, it's only 73 minutes, and the final act does build a great amount of suspense, even though the script is very much simple. It's very much a case of it is what it is, and that's the factor that does hold this film back, is that the script is very simple and straightforward, and you pretty much know where it's going and where it's going to end up because we've seen this type of story done so many times. However, back in 1956, it would be at least a bit fresher in terms of that concept not being done fully to death. So again, I can't stress how much that having Budd Boetticher and Lucien Ballard on the other side of the camera really brings something to this very simple story. It's also got a really above average supporting cast. You've even got the wonderful Michael Pate in there as another detective in a sort of thankless role, but having a really strong supporting cast, even if they are thankless roles, does help bolster the feeling of realism and having a lived-in quality because every role is being performed extraordinarily well, so it makes it feel more believable that even the side characters without much to do feel more three-dimensional and thus more like real actual people. But it's the leads, particularly Joseph Cotten and especially Wendell Corey, who pretty much walks off with the film because it's such a striking performance that you wish the film had a more, not only longer runtime, but it had more to play around with a runtime and a script that was a little bit more developed or had a little bit more going on. But also, again, you can't look at this film without thinking about Boetticher's Westerns. He was always a director who focused more on simple, effective, straightforward storytelling. It's almost a feeling of sort of no nonsense. That's you get that feeling here. The story does move along. Our characters have a sense of drive, and everything is not only set up perfectly, but is then carried out perfectly because we have that all important setup. So we know why all the characters are doing what they're doing and why they're doing certain things at certain moments. And it's this sort of grit and no nonsense quality that does drive the film along. And there is something to be said about a film having brevity, and the brevity of Boetticher's films always add something to the overall impact, and that means you can return to them time and time again because they don't lose that impact. So I think this film does have a lot of connections to what Boetticher was doing in the Randolph Scott Westerns, which basically bookend this film. And I think it's important to look at his non-Westerns because this film very much proves, like his other films that are considered noirs or crime films, that he could very easily operate in the noir realm. And, if you look at it closely, a lot of noir being based on what is now termed hard-boiled fiction of the era, there are a lot of parallels to the story structure of a Western. I mean, you could very much see The Killer is Loose as a Western, just changed the setting, and it would play exactly the same. So I think it's very fitting that, this is very well directed by one of the greatest Western directors of all time. So it very much fits in his oeuvre, if you want to call it that. Of course, he probably would never have called it that because of his very, again, his very no nonsense, but always still humorous style. There is a sense of humor here and a sense of life to it that is what you see in his westerns and why they're so timeless. And there is a timeless quality here because this is a very well made little programmer, but it's still a little programmer. So it does have those constraints. I do wish that the script was a little bit more developed. It's not super flashy. I know some people have said that maybe it would have helped if the villain was a bit more like Mitchum's Max Cady and Cape Fear in terms of being a more visible menace, a more physically felt menace. But I think there's something to be said about not having that here because it is a bit atypical. And again, there is a slight eerie quality to it, almost as if the killer who has escaped is almost a sort of avenging figure or avenging ghost-like figure of Cotton's character's own conscience. There's a lot of interesting things to sift through here, but it's still ultimately a lesser discussed programmer that UA released. So it's really nice to have it now available on this Blu-ray release to look at in HD and to look at one of the very little discussed Budd Boetticher films outside of his iconic westerns. Now to talk about the picture quality of this release. This is an old MGM master. It's obviously a good number of years old, and this film has had really the only video release I know of before this was one of MGM's manufactured on demand DVD-Rs that was done to try and compete with the Warner Archive, and they released a number of really obscure titles that had not gotten a video release before, but the masters were pretty much as is and just what was kind of floating around on the shelf and been done years ago. So it was really nice to see this pop up in HD, and of course it's important to have any of Budd Boetticher's filmography on Blu-ray. And I do really like how Classicflix does try to give the best possible treatment in the best way that they can, because they are a small company, to very obscure films or films that have just sort of fallen off the radar, and especially when they're able to give a good Blu-ray release treatment to a lesser known title from big name directors or really important directors or other members of cast and crew and things. So it's nice to have parts of their filmographies highlighted or at least given a Blu-ray release. So in terms of the overall quality of what you're going to see here, this is an older MGM master. It is from a print element of some kind, and there is plenty of overall where it's never major, and this does still make for a nice presentation, but it is an older MGM master, so you do need to expect there is some occasional frame wobble, some occasional bits of damage, some occasional scratches, lines, marks, little bits of movement. So, nothing outside the realm of what you'd expect from an old MGM video master that was probably done sometime in the maybe early to mid 2000s, maybe even earlier. There's just no telling. Or maybe it was just one that was done in the mid 2000s or late 2000s in terms of when they finally started doing HD masters hot and heavy for broadcast release, not necessarily for physical media releases, unfortunately. So it's obviously not a new scan, not a new master. It hasn't really been cleaned up. It's not a restored transfer. But it's overall quite solid, and it does upscale well to 4K resolution. So that's also something that helps, because not all older masters upscale well. Most of them, especially the not so good ones, when you upscale them, all the inherent iffiness of it being an old master is very much magnified. This, of course, being a print element of some type, there, of course, the dupe transitions, which are obviously of a lesser quality, which you obviously have to expect for any vintage films. You get the typical sort of quality drop off there, and then the pop back in when we go out into the main footage again. Then there's also one or two spots where some of the photography is a little bit softer, and I think that's just inherent to the source. There's also quite a bit of location photography mixed in, again getting back to that sort of mixture of real outdoor location photography and studio photography, so you will notice a bit of difference there, and some some of the location photography obviously is of different quality simply due to the way it was shot in photographs. So that's of course always going to have a bit of a different feel. The whole opening is pretty much location photography, for example. And then we go into a lot of studio footage, so you'll notice the difference between those, and you'll see that in pretty much any 50s noir that has a lot of location photography mixed in with studio photography. Now, my only issue with this, and unfortunately it's something I have seen once or twice on some of the Classicflix titles I've seen, it's very, very infrequent here, but you do get just a tiny bit of that sort of motion halo type effect around some people when they're moving, which seems to be something that's tied to disk encoding. It's very, very minor. It's never the full-blown awful motion grain frozen halos that you see in things like Paramount's awful Godfather Master, but it's something that is very much apparent when you're watching something upscaled to 4K. It's a lot easier to see that on an OLED when you're watching an upscale Blu-ray than if you're watching it in just standard 1080p, because when I was watching things on a plasma TV, I didn't really see encoding issues as much. It was very infrequent that I did, because it was a lot harder to spot, especially if it's like this, where it's so minor and it happens infrequently throughout the transfer, where I just finally realize what I'm seeing, and then I have to go back and go, wait, is that what I think it is? And then, look at a couple bits again and go, yeah, okay, I was seeing that. So it's very minor here, it's very infrequent. But if you're very eagle-eyed, or you notice encoding issues, or especially if you have a nice 4K television and you're watching this upscaled and it makes it easier for you to spot things like that, you will unfortunately see some light sort of motion haloing in some spots. It is very minor, but it does pop up a few little times, and unfortunately it's something I have seen once or twice in some other Classicflix discs, so I don't know exactly who does their encoding, but maybe just something happens at some point on certain titles that just gets missed or something. I hate to even bring this up, because I really like what the Classicflix company does and what their goals are, and I really love their releases and their whole ethos in terms of trying to preserve classic, more obscure films that have fallen under the radar and are films that other people simply are not bothering with. And they are doing important work in preserving these titles, but I just think every once in a while I just wish their disc encoding was just a little bit better. Thankfully, it's a very minor thing here. 99% of people are not going to notice it. I just noticed it because I'm watching it upscaled to 4K, and it did pop up once or twice, but they are extraordinarily minor. So again, I hate to even mention this, but I do my due diligence with every review I do. So now that I'm having to focus more on disc encoding across the board with every release, even when I see little tiny things like this, I do feel it's important to mention, just so it's there for the record. Now, in terms of the audio, we have a DTS HDMA presentation of the original mono mix. It sounds mostly good. There is some inherent distortion in terms of the loudest music passages, but I guess that they were also transferring, when MGM did this transfer, they were transferring maybe the optical audio off of this print element or something, because there is quite a bit of harshness in the dialogue at points. There's also a couple pops and ticks throughout the feature, and some instances of hum under dialogue and things. So it is very much coming from a used, worn element. It is pretty much what it is, and so it's amazing that it sounds as good as it does. It sounds fine. This is obviously a lower budgeted, more modest production, so you can't expect premium audio quality from say a 1950s A budget feature, but you do have to expect some wear and tear from age, and the fact that they're obviously not scanning the original negative and looking for original audio sources, and this master was done years and years ago, so there is unfortunately some damage and wear, and some occasional bits of hum, along with a harshness at times in the dialogue and the higher end. It's never bad or grating, but That's just apparently the condition of this particular audio element that they were using. Now to turn to the packaging and artwork, as usual, Classicflix has a lovely rendering of original poster artwork. I really love what they do with their cases. It does give them a sort of unique feel in terms of always having the white border and background, and then the Classicflix spine. So this matches nicely with their other releases, gives them a certain identity, but it also doesn't claim to be a special edition or spine numbered or anything. So it's sort of doing the boutique label thing without doing the boutique label thing, if that makes sense, which I do actually quite like, and it does give them a unique identity. We also have a nice inlay piece of artwork, which Classicflix always does. That's something that not everybody does, but I will say that everyone that I've seen from this label is a nicely chosen piece of artwork. This, of course, is from the incredible moment when our killer is on the work farm and we can see the wheels turning in his head where he is deciding to perhaps make a break for it. And then we have the typical Classicflix layout and design for the rear. This is their sort of standard approach, and I love how these are designed in terms of using some imagery from the film, being very simple and straightforward, nicely laid out with a nice description as well. It's like the film, very much to the point, very no nonsense, but with a sense of class and style and respect for the film itself. Unfortunately, there are no supplemental features. Most Classicflix titles don't have supplements. They're basically lucky if a trailer survives, but they do occasionally make a special edition with commentary, nice extras. So them being a small company, obviously they can't make every release a special edition, but they do try when possible. But this is just one of their many releases of a very obscure film that does not have really much of a video history at all. Very little is it even discussed or mentioned. So they are doing a lovely job at least getting a Blu-ray out there. Unfortunately, this was part of an MGM deal, which they had to, which lapsed eventually. So this and their other MGM held titles are out of print. So these are discs that you will have to track down on the used market, unfortunately, and they are starting to go up in price. But I don't see anybody relicensing these films anytime soon, and this one in particular is a must for Budd Boetticher fans. This is a very important film outside of his famous westerns that has many of the same hallmarks and core tenets and themes. So if you're a fan of the renowned westerns, as you should be, this is really an absolute must, sort of sister film, but in a different genre. So that's why I wanted to talk about this in particular, because it's a very obscure film, and this is really the only good major release of it. And it's one of the Classicflix discs that I've really enjoyed being able to finally see this in a nice widescreen HD master. And again, all the connections to Boetticher's westerns really come across when you see this film in close proximity to those. So that's why I thought it was important to do a video review of this as well. So those are my thoughts on the Classicflix Blu-ray release of The Killer Is Loose. I think it's one of their really wonderful Blu-ray releases of a lesser discussed film from a very notable director who still is not as respected as he should be. This is another one of the label's great noir releases that's really a must for any noir shelf, or any noirvember programming if you celebrate the month of Noirvember. My only real issue here is just I wish the encoding was a little tiny bit better, so you didn't have those fleeting sort of motion halos of sort of frozen stagnant grain and noise around people. They're very minor, but they are there if you notice encoding things like that. So that's really my only issue here. Everything else is obviously a product of this being an old MGM master and Classicflix just being able to license it, and being a small company. This is one of their earlier releases, so they were pretty much able to make a nice solid Blu-ray, but couldn't make any new extras and things. So that's understandable, obviously. And the element's in pretty good condition in terms of when it was prepared for the MGM master that's on this disc. So this is obviously the best release this film has ever gotten on video, and it's a must for Boetticher fans for sure, and a great addition to any noir library. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do give this film a try if you get the chance to, and hopefully you can track down a copy of the Classicflix release at not too terribly high a price on the used market. It's just unfortunate that MGM pulled their license, and so now you have to track down some of these Classicflix titles on the used market. And again, they've started going up in price on eBay, I've noticed, so that's going to become a more and more difficult challenge, unfortunately. But should you be able to, this is the best the film has ever looked and sounded on home video, because before this, we just had an MGM MOD DVD, and that was it. So, as always, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.